7 de la noche y voy a iniciar la grabación.
我们现在已经是7点钟，我们现在会开始录影。
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Elephant in the Room, PTA Links PTA Fundraising Equity webinar. We'll begin in a few minutes. Hopefully, more people will join us. And before we get started, we have some announcements. We have some interpreters here tonight. Mandarin and Spanish speakers will be able to comment and ask questions in their own languages assisted by our interpreters. The interpreters will take a few moments now to introduce themselves and explain how to access their services. Thank you.
Hola a todos, bienvenidos. El evento El Elefante en la Sala, webinario de equidad y recaudar fondos para los PTA o Asociación de Padres. Antes de empezar, vamos a tener unos anuncios. Tenemos intérpretes que nos acompañan esta noche. Las personas que hablan mandarín y español van a poder hacer aportes y preguntas en su propio idioma con apoyo de los intérpretes.
大家好，欢迎来到我们的 PTA 房间里的大象筹款公平分享会。我们会在几分钟之后就会正式开始。我们现在等待更多人来参加。我们开始之前呢，有几则的公告。我们今晚会有普通话和西班牙语的翻译，因此呢，在我们翻译员的协助下，各位讲中文或者是西班牙语的参与者都能在我们的会议中用自己的语言问问题和提意见。我们的翻译员将会介绍自己，还有呢会解释怎么用这个翻译功能。
Hello everyone, my name is Talesh and I am one of your interpreters today. My co-interpreter is Chivita and I will be interpreting between Spanish and English, and our co-interpreters Roxy, Christine, and Fran will be interpreting between Mandarin and English. Before we want to share some guidelines that will allow us to best support this multilingual space. I will be doing this introduction first in English, then in Spanish, and then Mandarin interpreter will do this announcement in Mandarin. Hola a todos, mi nombre es Telesh y soy una de sus intérpretes esta noche. Mi cointérprete Chivita y yo vamos a interpretar entre el español y el inglés, y nuestras cointérpretes Roxy, Christine y Fran van a interpretar entre mandarín y el inglés. Antes de empezar, queremos compartir unas pautas que nos permitirían apoyar este espacio multilingüe lo mejor posible. Voy a hacer esta presentación primero en inglés, luego en español y luego la intérprete de Mandarin lo hará en mandarín.
大家好，我叫 Christine，我是今晚其中一位中文的翻译，另外一位翻译员 Fran 会跟我进行中英文的翻译，而Chiffy 和 Talesh 则会用西班牙语进行翻译。我们开始这个会议之前呢，想要跟你们分享几项的指引，以助我们建立一个多语言的环境。我们先会用英文去介绍以下的指引，然后用西班牙语再重复一遍那些指引，最后呢，我们会用普通话再跟大家讲述一遍。
Creating a multilingual space is everyone's responsibility. We all have a part in making sure we can benefit from the knowledge and questions in this room, whether they are spoken in English, Spanish, or Mandarin. We ask that all participants speak at a moderate pace, like I'm doing right now. We ask that you mute your microphone if you're not speaking so we can hear clearly, and that only one person speaks at a time so we don't have to choose whose voice to prioritize. We are asking all participants to select their preferred language in the interpretation function so that we can all understand when people speak English, Spanish, and Mandarin. We have already activated the interpretation feature on Zoom. If you are joining us on your computer, you will see a globe icon at the bottom of your screen. To listen to interpretation, click on the globe and select English. Now, if you're joining us on your smartphone or tablet, click on the three dots where it says More, choose Language Interpretation, and select English. Finally, click where it says Done at the top right so that you can start listening to the interpretation in English when someone speaks Spanish. If you have problems doing this, please comment in the chat box and we will try our best to support you. Thank you. And now we will do the announcement in Spanish, followed by Mandarin. Crear un espacio multilingüe es la responsabilidad de todas las personas que estamos aquí. Todos tenemos un papel para asegurarnos que todos podemos beneficiarnos del conocimiento y preguntas en este grupo, ya sea que se hablen en inglés, español o mandarín. Les pedimos a todos los participantes que hablen a una velocidad moderada, como lo estoy haciendo ahora. Les pedimos que apaguen su micrófono si no están hablando para poder escuchar bien. Y les pedimos que solo una persona hable a la vez para no tener que escoger qué voz priorizar. Les estamos pidiendo a todos los participantes que seleccionen el idioma que prefieren en la función de interpretación para que todos podamos entender a las personas cuando hablan inglés, español o mandarín. Ya hemos activado la función de interpretación en Zoom, así que si usted se está conectando en su computadora, podrá ver el icono de un globo terráqueo en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Haga clic en el icono del mundito para escuchar la interpretación y seleccione español. Ahora, si se conecta desde su teléfono inteligente o tableta, haga clic en los tres puntitos que se encuentran en la parte inferior a mano derecha donde dice Más. Seleccione Interpretación de idiomas y después Español. Finalmente, dele clic en donde dice Finalizar en la parte superior derecha de la ventana para comenzar a escuchar la interpretación en español cuando se hable inglés o mandarín. Si tiene algún problema, por favor, comente en el chat y haremos nuestro mejor esfuerzo para apoyarle. Gracias y ahora haremos el anuncio de interpretación en mandarín.
Can you go back 2 slides, or 3 slides, to the Chinese instruction? Yes, here. Go back one more. Thank you. 创造多语言的空间是我们每个人的责任，无论对话是用英文、西班牙语或者是普通话去进行，我们都有责任确保我们可以在这个房间中，从这个房间中的知识跟问题中去受益。还有呢，我们要求所有的参与者都以适中的速度去讲话，就像我现在这样。如果你不是在发言的话呢，请把你的麦克风静音，以便我们可以清楚听到会议的内容，并且呢，每次只能有一个人讲话，以免造成混乱。我们要求所有的参与者在翻译功能中选择你自己想要收听的语言，以便你们都能理解所有的内容。我们现在呢，已经在 Zoom 上开启了这个翻译的功能。如果你用的是电脑，那请你在荧光幕的底部点击地球仪，并选择中文 Mandarin，以收听我们的普通话翻译。现在，如果你是透过手机或者是平板电脑去加入我们的话呢，请点击3个点。显示更多那边，选择语言翻译，选择中文 Mandarin， 最后点击右上角的完成。 这样呢，当有人在讲英文或者是西班牙语的时候呢，你就可以收听普通话的翻译。如果你在执行这个操作的时候遇到任何的问题，请在我们的聊天框中发表你的评论，我们会尽力为你提供支援。谢谢。口译的公告到此结束。
Thank you so much, interpreters. So welcome to the final installment of PTA Link's four-part webinar series of this school year, The Elephant in the Room, PTA Fundraising Equity. Please say hello in the chat and let us know your school and district. We'll be recording this webinar. Participants can keep their cameras off if they prefer. Please keep yourself muted unless we call on you. And participants can raise their hand or use the chat to comment or ask questions. There will be designated comment periods throughout the webinar, but we ask that you hold your questions until the end. So let's get started. So who are we? My name is Antonia Ferraro Martinelli, and I am the coordinator of PTA Link. I'm also a parent leader. I've been a parent leader in District 15 in Brooklyn for a while now. I was a PTA parent at MS 88, and I'm currently the president of the Community Education Council in District 15. And this platform, PTA Link, was created by a parent leader. Her name was Rachel Fine, and she saw this disparity between knowledge in PTAs, and she sought to fill it by creating our website and platform. And I'm joined today by my executive director, Naya Berg.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see so many faces, some familiar, some new in this space. As Antonia just introduced, my name is Naya. I am the executive director of New York Appleseed. And you might be wondering, I am here for a PTA Link event. You are, and you are in the right place. As Antonia just mentioned, PTA Link was acquired by Appleseed in the spring of 2022 now, or 2023, which seems far away. And we did so because we believe in parent empowerment and voice and leadership. And we thought that we could create a great home for PTA Link as a platform. And with that, I'm going to stay quiet and pass it back to Antonia because I'm really excited about today's presentation and excited about the guest speakers we have for you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If you wouldn't mind, Naya, there's a couple of people in the waiting room. Could you just shuffle them in? Thank you so much. Okay, so we are joined today by some really amazing guest speakers. We've got Dr. Claire Mackevicius. Say hello, Dr. Claire.
Hi, everyone. I'm Claire Mackevicius. You'll be hearing more from me in a few minutes about some of the work that I do, thinking about resources at schools and especially thinking a lot about PTA resources flowing to public schools.
Wonderful. Welcome. And welcome, Dr. Brittany Murray.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Brittany Murray. I'm an assistant professor of educational studies and political science at Davidson College. Hailing here from North Carolina, I'm right outside of Charlotte. My research is about school inequality and really the politics of parent involvement. And I'm just really excited to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. And we have a parent leader, Courtney Burke from Evanston, Illinois.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here tonight. I'm Courtney Burke. I'm a parent in Evanston, Illinois. I'm a co-chair of the PTA Equity Project, and I'm excited to discuss that more later in the evening.
Wonderful. All right. So why do I call this webinar The Elephant in the Room? This This is a conversation about resource disparities, and that conversation can be very challenging. We all know the disparity is large, with some PTAs raising $2 million and others raising just $2. Yet we ignore it because the problem is very hard to tackle. But PTA Link is here to support your organizations. So, whoops, let me go back a slide. So we're going to kick things off by asking some questions. Why do PTAs fundraise at all? What can PTA fundraising equity look like? And then our guest speakers are going to help us explore the elephant in the room, the pervasive fundraising disparities amongst New York City PTAs, why this disparity is important, and what models might exist to address it.
I'm listening to people talk about raising money for schools. That's why
Could somebody mute themselves, please? Okay, great. So you might be asking yourself, shouldn't everything that is required for a learning experience, the equipment, the staffing in a public school be paid for with tax dollars? So why do PTAs fundraise at all? They supplement. And I want you to hold on to that word supplement. What does it mean? It means to enhance. It is not to supplant. Supplant means to replace. And so PTAs are intended to supplement our school budgets to fill the gaps in education programs and technology upgrades and classroom supplies and enrichment or extracurricular activities, after school programs, sometimes school infrastructure, student health and wellness programs, and school events and activities. Lots of extras that make school fun. Oops, there we go. So to that end, Chancellor's Reg A660, which governs New York City PTAs, tries to ensure that PTAs are supplemental by mandating that fundraising be targeted to a specific need, a goal that your PTA develops in collaboration with principals. Fundraisers are not ends in themselves. And so the Chancellor's Reg specifically uses the word supplement. PTAs can't raise $5,000 just for the sake of having $5,000. It has to be tied to a real purpose. And so when thinking about what equity can look like in a PTA, I wanted to offer you a potential framework that was created by Integrate NYC, known as the 5 R's of real integration: race, restorative justice, resources, representation, and relationships. Today, we are going to focus on the resources aspect of the 5 R's. So let's talk about PTA fundraising equity just within a school for a moment. PTAs can function equitably within a school by asking themselves, are we developing goals guided by a school-wide mission and vision? Are we transparent with all of our members? Are we collaborating with all of the school stakeholders? I know I have met a lot of PTA members through these webinars, and I know a lot of you are really doing great work serving your whole school community. But have you noticed the elephant in the room? The elephant is the financial inequity system-wide. PTAs are not great mechanisms to address system-wide inequities, with some of our PTAs raising $2 million and some raising nothing. And inequity can lead to disparity. So when PTAs raise funds for vital resources, in other words, verging on supplanting the responsibility of the taxpayer for things like a new security door or a librarian or a music teacher or an after-school program or an air conditioner, these schools now have more budgetary flexibility to hire teachers. And this can lead to an imbalance in academic outcomes across the system. So now I'm going to turn this conversation over to our first guest speaker, Dr. Claire Mackevicius, who's going to explore the pervasive fundraising disparities within New York City PTAs.
Sure, thanks so much. And I'll take all reminders to slow my words down. I'll do my best though. So to share a little bit, and Antonia, if you want to click through to the next slide, I'll give you the very brief overview of something that I think a lot about, which is resources at public K-12 schools. And the majority of resources that flow to public K-12 schools in the United States come from state and local revenues that school districts decide how to distribute to schools, and then schools figure out how to spend those funds. There's a little bit of money flowing from the federal government. If the slide is big enough to see, the total spending at schools is that blue line. This is charting the total spending at schools over time. It's generally been increasing. And then the tiny federal share in the bottom in yellow or orange, and then state and local funds kind of make up the majority, though, of the total funds flowing to schools. And this is some work coming out of the Urban Institute. In some of the research that I've done, I've looked at, and kind of to echo what Antonia was bringing up, the effects of spending just sort of a generic dollar at schools can have a really big impact on the experiences that students have. So much of the research on school spending has to do with the government dollars flowing to schools, those state, local, and a little bit of federal dollars flowing to schools. The PTA dollars, though, and I'm going to use PTA as a shorthand for PTA and PA organizations at schools, can contribute a significant discretionary amount of dollars to these public schools that some schools have access to, and not all schools, though, do. I'll be sharing some of some really sort of high-level aggregate results based on some data that we have about New York City PAs and PTAs. And what I'm going to be doing when I show you these is generally showing you spending in per pupil terms. So all of sort of the research and policy related to school spending puts spending in per pupil terms, so that if you have a school that serves let's say 10 students, and a school that serves 100 students, and a school that serves 1,000 students, you're not looking at the total budget, which is going to be smaller at that much smaller school, but we're going to be talking about the per pupil spending. And so I'll be translating PTA spending into per pupil dollar amounts to chart some of the patterns that we can see across these organizations in New York City. So if you hop to the next to the next slide. So by way of a little bit of context for why we can even gather here and look at some of the data that I'll be sharing on the next few slides, is that back in 2018, New York City, Local Law 171 was put into effect, which requires an annual report from PTA organizations at all of the schools in the city to report a few things: their total budgets, their total spending, how much they have left at the end of the year. And so dating back to 2018, and we have data up through the 2023-2024 school year, we have this report of, for all of the schools that have PAs and PTAs, how much money were they bringing in, spending, and some of those really impactful inputs, as Antonia kind of previewed. And so we have information about the PTA spending. We also have information about the demographics at schools. So in this law, it specifically says that we'll be capturing the report will share information about school demographics, including economic need. So the report describes the share of students, they use the language of poverty. You're going to see that language reflected in the figures that I've pulled together. That's often using free and reduced price lunch eligibility as a criteria to categorize sort of the share of students economic need who are low income. They also capture data on the racial categories of the student population served and the share of students English language learners. So with that, I will move on to the next slide and dive into some of the data. This is a sort of high-level aggregate presentation of what we know about PTAs at New York City public schools for the last few years. I will share some of this. Most interested to hear what questions are coming up, what sort of considerations are coming up, what more do folks want to know? And thanks, Naya, for dropping in the chat. These data are public, so I was able to grab them and I'll talk through what I was sort of pulling together based on these data. And if anyone is interested to go looking further, all of these Excel spreadsheets are there for anyone in the public to take a look at. So what I'm presenting here is for about, as I said, we have data going back to 2018. So there's a little bit of fluctuation and change year over year, but there are about 1,000 organizations that are reporting some kind of spending in these reports. And I'll talk a little bit about changes over those years on the next slide. But just on average, oh, sorry, but if you stick on this slide though, on average, the total budget for a PTA organization at a school in the city is a little more than $80,000. Translating that into per pupil terms, it's almost $140 per pupil. Now on the left, what this figure is showing is the count of organizations that are spending a certain amount per pupil. So all the way to the left, there are a whole lot of organizations that are not spending hardly anything. They're close to a $0 per pupil spend. These are organizations that don't have a huge fundraising capacity during the year, and they're not sort of supplementing the budgets at public schools by a lot. On average, though, they're spending a little more than $100 per pupil. But what I chart on the right, because those organizations just fall off the chart if you're just looking at sort of the lower 95% of organizations, the very, very highest spending organizations are spending thousands of dollars per pupil. So they're supplementing the budgets at public schools so that range, they're about $15,000 in government dollars flowing to public schools. So imagine a few $1,000s per pupil on top of that. So the big organizations, the big PTAs have sizable budgets, and those supplemental funds that are flowing to the schools are really can be really significant, kind of that long right tail of the highest spending organizations. So if you hop to the next slide. This law that I described came into effect in 2018. And so what this is just charting is the average per pupil spending for each school year. So back in 2018, for those organizations, as I mentioned, there are about 1,000 who are reporting each year. They're spending about $340 per pupil. So the average spending in 2018 that these organizations reported was much higher than the average spending in some of these more recent years. There are lots of threads to pull and considerations, and I'm curious what's coming up for folks. I imagine, well, this was the first year that the data got reported, so maybe the largest organizations were reporting and some of the smaller ones weren't. There may be new organizations popping up that aren't spending as much. And there's And there's sort of a predictable fall in the sort of most extreme COVID years that we observe, not just in New York City, but in some of the work that we've done with these organizations across the country. So down in 2020, that's the lowest per pupil spending by these organizations as they reported. And in the last couple of years, there's sort of been this trajectory upwards. The figures that I showed on the last slide and on the next couple slides are taking the data from the last school year we have data. So 2023, 2024 are some of those averages that I showed you and that I'll be showing you. So if you hop to the next slide, I'm going to sit on this and describe the figure, and I'm happy to return to this when we have a pause for questions or any kind of Q&A. But what this is charting is the stark inequity in the spending by PTA organizations across schools. So on the y-axis, that's charting the spending by these organizations, again, in per pupil terms. So this ranges from $0 all the way up to more than $400 per pupil. And then on the x-axis, this is the percent poverty. So this is the share of low-income students that a school is serving, and it's increasing as you go along the x-axis. So all the way to the left and all the way up high, those are schools serving a very low share of low-income students who have PTAs that are spending more than $400 per pupil. And then as that sort of curved line goes down and you see more and more dots representing schools that are serving a higher share of low-income students, if they have a PTA organization, that organization is spending a whole lot less per pupil. So to what some of Antonia was previewing about inequities in just the capacity to raise funds and spend dollars, the supplemental discretionary dollars that schools have are inequitable in that wealthier serving schools have just some of them have a huge amount of these discretionary dollars as compared to the dollars that are available and supplementing the budgets at schools that are serving a higher share of low-income students. So if you hop to the next slide, what I was just showing you was thinking about inequities in terms of economic capacity. That was describing the share of low-income students at a school. What this figure is showing, and this is now outside of the New York context, this is showing on average, if you look at the difference in spending by PTA organizations across schools within districts, and this is actually looking at the relative share of white students who are served. So if you flip, now on the x-axis, it's a higher share, a higher relative share of white students served at a school as you go along the x-axis. And there's this patterned higher spending by PTA organizations at schools that are serving a higher share of white students within districts in Illinois. I've done this also in California. So this reflects inequities that are not only about sort of an economic capacity to raise funds. There's also a racialized element in terms of the inequities in PTA organizations. And this is some of the work I've done in other contexts. And when I started to dive into this newly available data in New York City, the inequities in New York City match those inequities elsewhere. And if anything, they're even more pronounced. Sort of these inequities are even more extreme and patterned. So if you hop to the next slide, and this is, I'll wrap up with just a couple more figures similar to those first ones that I presented that were showing the spending by PTA organizations. So some of the data that we have about these organizations is how much they're holding in reserve balances, or how much these organizations have that they took in through fundraising and didn't spend in this school year. So at the end of the year, a pot of money that they're sitting on that could get spent next year, but it was not spent this year. So these reserve balances are averaging about $45,000. So that's about half of the average budget of a PTA is sort of the average reserve balance that these organizations are holding. Similar to the first sort of dramatic long right tail of some of the biggest organizations spending a lot, this is now cut the lowest 3/4 of organizations on the left. There are a whole lot that aren't holding any reserve balances hardly at all, but there's that long right tail, and on the right-hand figure, the top quarter of PTA organizations are holding tens of thousands, upwards of hundreds of thousands in reserve balances year over year that aren't getting spent to serve the students at that school. They're being held in reserves. If you click to the next slide, I'm layering on those reserve balance amounts now as opposed to the spending during the year that the organizations are doing, but what are they holding in reserves? This is back into per pupil terms. And charting again the inequities in terms of the share of low-income students at schools, where wealthier serving schools are holding much, much larger reserve balances than schools that are serving a higher share of low-income students. There are sort of, as promised, many, many different threads to pull. There's a really thoughtful question in the chat that I think we'll pick up on once Dr. Murray talks a little bit more and adds a little bit more nuance to. I'm just presenting numbers of spending without talking about what those dollars are spent on, what's going on with these organizations. So we'll touch on that in a few minutes, I think. But there are lots of threads to pull in terms of the reserve balances, what's getting spent, layering on other elements of and characteristics of schools to better understand what can be really stark discrepancies across schools in terms of these supplemental funds flowing from PTAs and PAs at these schools. I think Antonio, you'll wrap, and then we'll transition over to Dr. Murray.
Yeah, thank you so much, Claire. And thank you for highlighting the issue with PTA reserves. So one wonders why PTAs have such large reserves. If they're following Chancellor's Reg A660, their fundraising has to be targeted to a specific school-centered goal in order to, and the reason we have that rule is so that we want to ensure that your contributions as parents to the PTA are spent on your children in that school year. And one explanation for these reserves is that as PTAs grow into these mature nonprofit organizations, their priorities can deviate from supporting the student to the success of the organization as a whole. And so PTAs often have to find that balance between supporting current students and prioritizing the long-term sustainability and growth of this traditional nonprofit. And so one of the other things that we can learn from the PTA reporting to City Council is that PTAs collectively ended last year with a very large reserve of over $46 million. And looking back the last 6 years of reporting, which began in 2018. Could somebody mute themselves? Thank you. When we look back over the reporting from the last 6 years, we see that these yearly total reserves range from 40 million all the way to as high as 87 million. So we consistently have this big citywide reserve that is sort of a quasi endowment that nobody is spending. It begs a lot of questions. And why should we care about these reserves? And why should we care about this disparity at all? I mean, New York City is one school district. And the collective success of New York City public schools, it reverberates through education policy decisions at the state level, which impact all of our schools. And those decisions include enrollment, admissions, fair student funding weights, foundation aid formula decisions, space, construction, privatization. Strong PTAs are marketing that can lead to greater school enrollment. They can hold significant sway over school admissions decisions. They can influence fair student funding rates. I mean, some of our schools have their own specific fair student funding rates, as well as lucrative PTAs. And influential PTAs can be powerful advocates for state funding. We know our principals lean heavily on their PTAs for space, better facilities, for pushing back at attempts to co-locate. So PTAs are really part of our democracy because being part of a PTA is like voting for your school. But the danger of the PTA disparity is that successful efforts to supplement can actually become a vehicle to supplant the responsibility of the city, state, and federal government to fund our schools, jeopardizing funding streams to schools in low-income communities that don't have such lucrative PTAs. So we're going to now explore this issue more, the importance of PTA equity, with Dr. Brittany Murray. Hello, Brittany.
All right. Thank you for teeing me up. So I am back here to talk about a little bit more context around this issue of PTA inequity that we've been discussing. And we're actually going to zoom in a little bit. And so Dr. Mackevicius has talked a lot about between school funding inequities. Why does one school have so much more than the other? Antonia, if you'll go to the next slide, we're going to zoom into a school, right? Because that's just one way to think about PTA funding inequities. But they also pop up within schools, right? So not just how much one school has compared to another, but what's happening within a single PTA. And so I popped this picture up here of the podcast Nice White Parents. You may have heard about it. It actually features schools in New York City public schools. And it actually describes one story that stands out to me is about a group of white affluent PTA parents who move into this diverse school and fundraise for the French program while pushing out the marginalized families that are already present in the school and kind of ignoring the broader interests and needs of the school, right? One of those being the needs of Spanish speaking students at the school, kind of while valorizing the French speaking goals of the school, right? And so this is very interesting. It's a very entertaining podcast, but it actually really does resonate with a lot of the research literature about PTA inequities within schools, especially diverse schools. And so there's three questions that I really ask when I'm thinking about within school fundraising disparities. And it's about one, who gets a say in the PTA? Two, how are PTO resources directed? So and that resonates with the question in the chat. And then three, what's the impact of all this? So let's talk about that first question a little bit. Antonia, if you don't mind going to the next slide. So this question about who gets a voice in school decision making, a lot of the research literature across schools across the country document the high presence of white affluent families in charge of school PTAs and PTOs, right? Lots of mothers, lots of stay-at-home mothers. And the research suggests that there's this need to have resources to be able to fully participate in the PTA, right? Sometimes meetings are held at 8 o'clock in the morning when many working families are going to the office or going into work. PTAs are asking for a lot of money to participate and donations to be involved. There's time away from your kid when you have to cook dinner or when you have to, watch your other children, right? And so there's this flexibility that really comes with a lot of white collar jobs that you need to even be able to have a say and participate in this form of school decision making. The other thing that we've seen in the research literature is that and you need some credentials in a lot of schools to be a part of the PTA. A lot of PTAs look for parents with fundraising experience or grant writing experience, or who can keep a budget, right? There was actually a job ad for positions in my school's PTA where they were looking for people with certain skills to have particular roles. And so that can exclude lots of people who either don't have those credentials or may not feel as confident about what they're bringing to the table to be a part of the PTA. What I've also seen in the research is that when there is a PTA, and even if the PTA is diverse, white parents are in charge of the monetary decisions, while they ask Black and Latino families or Black and Latino parent groups to bring the food, bring the culture, do the cleanup, more isolated tasks rather than being responsible for the global planning and kind of decisions around how money is spent and what the broader agenda is. And what we also see is that, with this high presence of white affluent families at the helm of these organizations, they're very tight knit networks, friendship networks that are almost like cliques, where it's really hard for people who are outside of that network to break into that network and be a part of those friend groups who tend to run everything from maybe the group chat, right? So that there are these equity issues around who gets a say in making school decisions within the PTA. The next question is, how are these PTA resources directed? And what the research finds, again, it really resonates with that Nice White Parents episode, is that PTA parents tend to direct resources toward programming and opportunities that their own children benefit from. Right. And so the paper that I have cited here talks about one school where the kindergarten families, you know how it is to be a kindergarten parent. You're so excited to have your little one going into school the first time. You see a lot of kindergarten and first grade families in the PTA because enthusiastic moms want to be involved, right? In this particular school, the PTA fundraised for the playground that would just benefit the kindergarten and first grade families, right? And so you see that happening not just with the playground that the PTA funds, it primarily benefited those parents' children, but also if you think about magnet programs within the school. Uh, Magnet school parents are more likely to be involved and often direct some of those resources toward the magnet program, whether it be instructional materials, Montessori materials, for example, that benefit that program, right? Another way that we've seen this show up is what PTA parents use their human capital to advocate for. And sometimes that can be in opposition to diversity and equity in a school, right? So this other book that I'm referring to documents how PTA parents kind of organize at the district level to shut down any kind of equity-oriented policies that their children do not benefit from. That can look like holding on tight to the gifted and talented programs or the tracking programs that occur in a school. Somebody's looks like they're tripping on the slide, but that's okay. Or it could be in opposition to some programming that might just benefit a racial or economic group. So we can go on to the next slide. And so what's the impact of this? Why do we care about that? So I see somebody's asking what the book is. I can actually type that into the chat a little bit later, but also that one of the books is Inequality in the Promised Land by LaRue Lewis McCoy, and the other is When Middle Class Families Choose Urban Public Schools by Lynn Posey Maddox in that last slide. So what's the impact? Why do we care about this? And some of my own work finds that PTAs actually, even though they are a benefit to all students, right? A rising tide kind of raises all boats. But what we see is that PTAs actually benefit some students more than others. And so particularly in reading achievement, some of my own research finds that when kids are in schools with PTAs, the rich kids actually benefit more from having those PTAs than poor kids. And so it begs this question again, what is it that PTAs are doing within schools exactly? What are they funding? What are they supporting that might benefit one group of students over the other, or in this case, affluent students more than poor students? Another issue that we see emerge is this idea of privilege dependence. And so, because of all the valuable resources that PTAs and PTA parents bring to a school, we see this process of educators, principals, teachers begin to value PTA parents and these affluent white parents more than they do the involvement efforts of Black and Brown families in the school. And so, in turn, you have this relationship where educators work to make sure those parents are happy and they don't leave and they don't opt out to other schools. And so, they work to curry favor with those parents, oftentimes by rewarding their children, whether it be a homework pass, whether it be a looking the other way. Maybe for a disciplinary or a behavioral issue. But educators tend to um, bend to the will of advantaged parents in schools who are bringing those resources while kind of disregarding families that don't engage in those particular ways. Um, I think there's this common misconception in schools that Black and Brown families are not involved, but actually, their involvement just looks different than the middle class white family, right? And so that's not something that should be disregarded. It's something that should be celebrated, but that's not actually what's happening in schools because of these resources that the PTA can provide. The other process is this idea of marketing schools to attract more advantaged families because of this privilege dependence and wanting to get more advantaged families in the building, whether it's for raising test scores, whether it's for, getting that fundraising support. What happens is as we're working to attract these advantaged families to our schools, we're actually pushing out and making these schools inaccessible to the marginalized groups that may have been there from the beginning, right? As these schools accrue more resources. And so this kind of perpetuates that cycle of race and socioeconomic segregation between schools, and then leads us right back into that issue that Dr. Miscavige just talked about with that between school resource inequality, where all the Black and Brown and poor kids go to certain schools with low fundraising PTAs, and advantaged kids go to the big PTA schools, right? And so all of this is a kind of a self-perpetuating cycle. And so, to leave you all, I want to think a little bit about alternative models for what this can look like. So if we can go to the next slide, I just want to leave you with some ideas of what parents across the country have been trying out, because this is a pervasive issue all around, not just in New York City public schools. And so I have two different kinds of examples to talk about briefly. These kind of redistributive models where districts have attempted to redistribute PTA dollars to allocate them across schools more equitably. And then also within schools, I've seen some alternatives to just having the PTA in a school, right? I've seen what I'm calling parent affinity groups. And so to start with the redistributive models, I'll talk about three different types of redistributive models in a school district. So Evanston Public Schools, we actually have a parent here from Evanston who will talk much more in detail about how this looks. Established a one fund where all the PTAs in the district actually put their funds into one pot, and then allocate it more equitably across schools. In Ann Arbor Public Schools, they actually do something different. They actually have a fundraiser. So they're raising money, and that can be from PTAs, it can be from individual parents, it can be from community organizations. But the central PTA organization hosts this big fundraiser every year to then donate those dollars to Title I schools or schools that have a certain percentage of students receiving free or reduced price lunch in the building, right? So the idea being that if we can fundraise this money, we're helping balance out some of those equity issues. Then I've also seen another model in Portland Public Schools where they have this kind of fundraising formula where they're thinking about after a school raises X amount of dollars, then we are taking 30% of that and putting it into a pot to then reallocate more equitably. And so there's lots of different models, but in kind of each of these cases, there's some varying degree of resistance to some of these equity models, right? Many parents don't like the idea of their dollars going to a school that their child does not go to, right? And so what we've seen is some gaming of the system, right? Maybe we'll call this a PTA fundraiser, maybe we won't. Maybe we'll, in order to prevent our money being sent to another school, maybe we'll classify it under another umbrella, right? You also have flight that occurs, right? So once some of these ideas have been proposed, you lose some parents to private schools in the district because, again, there's this desire for one's own dollars to benefit one's own child in their school, right? And you've also seen that at a more collective level where parents, once this model was implemented, actually threatened to even secede from the district, right? And create their own smaller school district with the set of schools in the wealthy neighborhoods, as opposed to sharing now both their private PTA dollars and their local tax dollars with students who have a greater socioeconomic need. And so there's a lot of resistance to that model, but it definitely has promise for equalizing that access to PTO resources. And just this last point that I'll talk about is within schools, we've seen some alternative models to only having the PTA in a school. Parent affinity groups allow Black parents, Latino parents, Asian parents, their own separate spaces. So that there's not just one organization controlling all of the decision making. However, in cases that are in the research, at least, we've seen a hierarchy take place between these organizations, again, putting the white parents in the PTA on top and some of the parents in the other affinity groups at the bottom, where the PTA is still the primary place for the monetary donations. And then the other groups have more marginalized roles and contributions to that. So none of this is perfect. And Courtney will jump in a second and talk a little bit more about the nuance to this, but I hope that helps shed a little bit of light on what the within school resource and equity piece looks like. Thank you.
Unmute myself. Thank you so much, Dr. Murray. That was great. So we'll now pause for your questions. Naya, would you be so kind as to manage the questions?
Absolutely. Not a problem. And I know there was one early on in the chat, and I think Brittany, you spoke on this a bit, but talking about what PTAs are spending on events, giving money to the schools to meet a need. I don't know if there's anything you want to elaborate further on. And also Antonia, if you want to jump in, or Claire.
Sure. Yeah, I've seen a few different models. I know we've talked a lot about supplementing public school budgets, and I think that is a lot of what PTAs do, is supplementing with technology, right? Making sure, especially during COVID, right? PTAs were really stepping in to make sure all students had a Chromebook or something to take home. There's also this negotiation with the principal that I've seen, where in some cases the PTA is pretty free to fund whatever they want to. In other cases, I've seen the principal enact a little bit more control over what the PTA does and says, I need this, you don't fund outside of these parameters. In other cases, though, I've seen a little bit more competition amongst schools in terms of their fundraising goals and priorities, right? Well, the school down the street does this many field trips every year. We want to make sure our students can do just as many field trips every year. And so now we're stepping up our fundraising because we want our kids to have just as many opportunities as that kid down the street who's going to space camp every year through their school, like in Florida at NASA, right? So there's a huge range of what PTAs are funding. I would say in most cases, I've seen that they're really funding teachers, right? And I think that says a lot about what our public dollars are not funding. But they're supplementing teachers' salaries so that they can attend professional development, so that they can get access to the instructional materials that they need, so that they can take their kids on that really cool field trip to get hands-on in the content, right? So it's a huge range. And I'll stop there.
Yeah. I guess I'll just jump in that I mean I've seen PTAs raise just for things like a coat drive for children who lose their coats. Children always are leaving and leaving their coats behind. And I know I ran a coat drive fundraiser. But then, of course, you have PTAs who are raising for the salary of a librarian because I don't know if you know this, but you're mandated to have a library, but if you don't have a librarian, a certified librarian, you cannot open your library and use it. So some PTAs are raising for a librarian. And when you are raising for those staff positions, which you are allowed to do under A660s, non-mandatory staff positions, an art teacher, like the extra staff positions, that means your principal can now hire more actual real teachers. And then you might have smaller class sizes, and then your children might have more attention. And so it really does make a difference because it's not just about raising for the school dance. It's not just about raising for the fifth grade trip or whatever. When you're raising money for a security door for the building, what's going on here? Is the school down the street getting that same security door, and why not? So I don't know if that question, if there was more to that question other than just what have you seen, but
I see a hand, Maria, and I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong.
Yeah, it's okay. It's Amiria. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Brittany. I'm just, because we're being recorded, I just want to make sure I introduce myself, Amiria Allen. I am a proud parent of an 8-year-old in District 19, and he goes to PS 108K, which is a landmark school as well. I am the vice president of the PTA. This is my second year, right? The first year was very challenging. This year, it's a lot better. However, there is still struggle when it comes to fundraising. And while the other women who are part of the e-board are great and full of ideas, right? Sometimes the execution kind of falls short because of time. We're working parents, right? Whether we're stay-at-home moms and have our own businesses, or full-time fully working as well as taking care of our aging parents, right? And we understand those are the factors and barriers. However, I'm very curious to know, because it's not my first time hearing about the inequity, and I've also tracked other school districts and what PTA is raising, and I'm always like, oh my gosh, how do we get to this point? But nonetheless, Dr. Brittany, you mentioned this, and I've heard this narrative before. Black and brown parents show up in different ways, right? Can you share a little bit more? Because I'm never sure. I know how I show up, but and the parents, some of the parents around me, I am aware of how they show up, but I'm not necessarily 100% sure if my fellow parents are showing up. So can you just provide some clarity on that?
Sure, happy to. And I'm saying this as, a Black parent who has children in school, who studies PTAs, working parent, right? But is not a big part of my kids' PTA, right? Like, and I have absolutely felt this dilemma. But what the research literature talks about is that Black and Brown parents are often more involved at home, and have huge, higher aspirations for their children, than white parents. And because education, especially in the Black community, has been such, a stepping stone for upward mobility, that kind of instilling these values around education in school is a huge part of the way that Black and Brown families get involved. And the other thing we have to do is protect our kids from discrimination within these really diverse places, right? So a lot of the advocacy that Black and Brown families take on is making sure that, our kids don't fall between the cracks, right? Because of the predominantly white teaching staff that are in public schools across the country have implicit biases that may lead to over disciplining Black kids more than white kids, right? Or not recommending, Black kids for gifted and talented programs, or, over identifying our kids for special education services, right? So, the Black parents are constantly kind of trying to buffer their kids from a white dominated institution that tends to, leave them out of opportunities. And we often do that individually, right? And so I would think, part of that distinction that I'm making here is that Black parents were often working in silos, and white parents are often working collectively within groups like this to ensure that their kids often get every advantage, right? And in a lot of ways, it's because we're having individual issues and challenges, interpersonal challenges with teachers, who have these assumptions about Black and Brown families that kind of isolates us from and drains us and burns us out before we're even able to get to the PTA. And so sorry, I'm mixing a little bit of research with my own experience because it's like one here, but yes, that don't let the narrative and the stereotype, overshadow all the incredible and important work that Black and Brown parents do on behalf of their children.
Thank you. Great question. Um, we got a couple questions that I think the latter half of this will answer, but I do want to, Claire, based on your research and Brittany as well. Do you have any examples you'd be interested in uplifting of districts where fund sharing has been successful, or that you've come across in your research where the conversation has at least been started successfully?
So my answer will tee up our next guest. Because if we didn't have Courtney joining us, I would do a worse job of describing what's gotten up, what the PTAs in Evanston, Illinois have gotten up to, as a really powerful example of parents working from the grassroots, to do something about those really sort of stark patterns that that I can show sort of aggregate, data and research on, and you can really feel in a really visceral sense as, someone in the folks in the Evanston community. Dr. Murray talked a little bit about, what's going on, in Ann Arbor. We might pick that back up a little bit. But listen to Courtney, I think, who will share a really powerful story, about what happened in Evanston, I would say.
Great. I don't see any other questions in the chat, and I feel like a lot of them are excited about Courtney. So why don't we go and
move on.
transition that way?
Yeah. So let's talk about some potential models. There are some models of PTA equity out there. One that already exists in New York City is the PTA Fund Run, which fundraises for Title I schools. Another model is you can make use of your president's councils. They can have bank accounts and treasurers and can raise funds across your entire district. There are also PTA buddy pilots where PTAs from different schools partner together with each other on a shared goal, and they can hold joint meetings together. They can work on many projects together. And then there are some models that may require a bit of research, district-wide community engagement before making a recommendation, because these are bigger lifts. For instance, district-wide funds. Districts can partner with a fiscal conduit to establish a fund. In fact, District 13 partners with Brooklyn Org as a fiscal conduit to establish their District 13 partnership fund, which exists in the superintendent's office. You can also do reserve caps to ensure that parents are confident that their funds are being spent in that year. And then there are redistribution models like the one that our next guest, Courtney, is going to talk about. So I will turn it over to Courtney.
Hi, everyone. Courtney here. I'm very grateful to be here with you all tonight. I have been involved with the PTA Equity Project now for the last 2 years, and I'm excited to share with you what we've been up to here in Evanston, Illinois. For many years, several of our District 65 parents and caregivers recognized very large disparities in our PTA funding across the district, which led to very different school experiences for our students, families, and even our teachers. As we have heard tonight, funding affects how many and what type of community building events a PTA can host, how many enrichment activities and scholarship opportunities a PTA can provide, and the monetary support PTAs can provide teachers for things like school supplies. If you could go to the next slide, I'm going to go over a timeline that kind of overlooks how we came to our one fund. Back in 2016, community caregivers in our district decided it was time to take the collective energy and expertise of our PTAs to address inequities district-wide. We wanted to expand our thinking from my school to my district. They started with a group of representatives from all 16 of our district's PTAs. We had teacher representatives, a principal representative. This group came together to better understand the inequities in our schools and to think through how to address these inequities. This resulted in the creation of the PTA Equity Project. We call it PEP. In 2017 and in 2018, the committee went through a listening and learning process. The committee held meetings, interviewed every PTA, administrators, and community members. They collected data and used all this information to formulate a funding intervention to ensure that every District 65 school hit a minimum level of PTA funding. However, in 2020, we all know what happened. COVID hit. PEP engaged in COVID emergency relief efforts with funding contributed by all of our District 65 PTAs. We all dug into our reserves that we spoke about earlier and really emptied our reserves to try to support those in our district and all the families who were in greatest need. While these steps were in the right direction, we were at a point where the intervention didn't fully achieve our community's equity goal. The solution was to create a one fund model. The model we currently operate within is that all 16 of our District 65 PTAs combine the funds that we raise annually through one school year into one pot, the one fund. The funds are then redistributed back to each of our District 65 PTAs using the one fund model, which is based on two factors: an equality portion and an equity portion. The equality portion distributed is 55% of the total funds raised in the whole district. This portion is divided among every single student at each school. For example, if 55% of the total funds raised was $220,000, and if we have 6,500 students in our district, each individual PTA would get $33 per student at their school to spend that next school year on whatever they're up to. The equity portion distributed is 45% of the total funds raised. This portion is divided among every student who receives free or reduced lunch at each school. So if 45% of the funds raised was $180,000, for example, and the district has 2,400 students receiving free and reduced lunch, each PTA would receive $75 per student who receives free or reduced lunch at their school. Let's take a moment to acknowledge that basing need on free and reduced lunch is not a perfect model. It cannot accurately capture need in our school, but
It seems like Courtney is frozen.
can you hear me?
Oh, okay, you're back now.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Could you let me know which part I took off on?
You just were acknowledging that free and reduced lunch is not a great model for determining need.
Thank you so much.
We heard that.
It is not, yes, it is not a great model for acknowledging need, but it was and is still the only data point that we PTA caregivers have access to that will work with our model and our formula. We continue to operate through the One Fund model, and I'd like to take a moment to highlight some of the impacts we've seen in our community since we've been living this model. If we can go to the next slide, please. So our schools are hosting more collaborative fundraisers. These
Oh no.
Our fundraisers now focus on transformational fundraising rather than transactional fundraising. We no longer host buy-in parties. If you know what, that's where you pay a ticket to attend a closed event, basically. We no longer host galas, both of which tend to have barriers for entry. Those could be financial barriers, childcare barriers, language barriers. Transformational fundraising is reframing fundraising away from pay to play and challenging ourselves to offer an experience that leaves a seat at the table for everybody, but we can still raise funds. Our schools are seeing more student enrichment opportunities. Some of our schools that historically have had a lower capacity for fundraising are now having more field trips, assemblies, and book fairs, for example. We're seeing students and hosting activities that don't even require a fee to participate. All of this is happening with autonomous spending and budgeting within each school's PTA. The One Fund is built on trust. All of this allows for a stronger feeling of community in our schools and in the greater community. Thank you so much for allowing me to share what we've been doing here in Evanston. And I was a little nervous for the crowd, so apologies that I'm reading my script. Thank you.
Not a problem at all. Thank you so much, Courtney. I mean, one of the things I really admire about the One Fund is that your community got together and said, look, it's not just about the money. Look what's going on. Our families have a lot of need. COVID is happening. We need to use our reserves. How can we build this better for the future? And they really emphasized that it's about relationships and representation. I mean, PTAs really mainly exist to represent the parents, not exclusively to fundraise, but through resource sharing across our schools and districts, PTAs can build these relationships, which can increase volunteer capacity. People power is a resource, and fostering a truly representative community can translate into effective advocacy on education issues, and that advocacy can in turn cultivate resources for your school, which steer the responsibility for funding our schools back to the taxpayer so that our PTAs can function as they're intended to supplement and not supplant the responsibility of the city and the state and the federal government. So I think people are going to have a lot of questions about everything you just said, Courtney, especially about what's the difference between transformational fundraising and how you were fundraising before. So I think we're just going to turn it back to questions. Naya, would you be able to manage the questions in the chat?
Yes. Let me repin everyone. Okay. That's fine. Okay. All right. Any questions for our guest speakers or about anything this evening? Or you raise your hand or put it in the chat. Antonia, did you mention D13?
Yes, they have a model, the D15 Partnership Fund, which has a fiscal conduit, which is the organization Brooklyn Org. And so I think what happens there is outside businesses and organizations can work with the district office to support District 15 schools.
Well, I'm not. Oh, here's a question just came through. It says, what about inequality of geography? Any thoughts on the responsibility of schools in wealth areas to their neighbors? I think this is also a question that we often get in addressing school segregation as an organizational mission. But I'll pass it to, I see all panelists nodding their head. I don't know who would want to take it first. Brittany, you want to?
Sure, I can. The first thing that comes to mind here is not so much of the onus being on PTAs, but on our public school structures, our districts, making sure that our school attendance zones are are not gerrymandered. I will say, right, and that is a particular issue in the South where I am. But making sure that when there's a proposal to expand a school attendance boundary and invite a community in that may be low resource, that I think the one thing that parents can do is really, before this gut reaction to reject and shut down and keep my school, like I think we have to really reflect on that, because I see that often. I think those times when there are enrollment and boundary changes in our school districts, there's a real opportunity there to reshape resources across these geographies that we're talking about. And I often see the collectives of parents work together to shut that down, to shut down the prospect of students coming into your school that don't look like you, don't speak like you, that kind of thing. And so I think a lot of the onus is on our elected school and officials and leaders to think about how they're drawing these attendance boundaries, given that we have this local property tax contribution to schools that is already kind of an inequitable way to do things. So how can we get our states to provide more of the funding to schools rather than relying so much on these local property taxes, which are super inequitable? But when those opportunities do come about to expand who is in our community, I think that we should capitalize on those.
Thank you. And we also just had a question come through for you, Courtney. If you have any examples of fundraisers that that you use that don't have a pay-to-play barrier to entry.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. One, we have a few, but one I'd like to highlight is annually we have a fundraiser called Pep Fest. Pep Fest is a grassroots, zero money startup fundraiser. So we hold the event at one of our school grounds each year. We ask vendors to come to our fundraiser for if they would like to sell items, but and they would pay us to be at Pep Fest. That is how we can raise funds in that way. But while we are holding this Pep Fest, it is a free event. We also have our District 65 PTAs there, and they are hosting a free family-centered activity. So we have 16 different PTAs aiming for 16 free kid-centered, family-friendly activities for people to participate in. We also ask for community collaborators for this event. We ask our public library to come and offer a free activity or share resources. We also have asked the City of Evanston, as well as our own district administration, to host a free activity or share resources. And this has lent itself to an opportunity where we can raise money through the vendor fees, and we do offer a raffle for $1 a ticket to make it accessible. And then also, while this is an open free fundraiser, we are able to also offer free activities. So there is no cost to attend. And by attending, there is activities for no cost. So that is one example. I'll pause there. Apologize for speaking quickly. I'm trying hard not to.
Thank you. And I dropped this before, but I'll do it again. I know we did a lot on research and digging into this very complex dilemma that we are continuing to try to bring solutions to. I will drop once more in the chat that we have also for folks that might have more nuts and bolts questions. We have a whole section on fundraising at PTA Link, and you also have our emails there if there are any questions regarding fundraising ideas, raffles, other pieces. I don't see any other questions, Antonia. I think I can pass it to you to close us out.
Okay. I actually want to ask Courtney a question. I think we have a little time to do it. Could you just speak about transactional fundraising versus transformative? This is the first time I've heard it put in those terms, and I would like you to just share with us about that.
Absolutely. Well, I should say to summarize and how my brain sees it, is that transactional fundraising would be, I'm paying something, so I get something. I'm paying for a ticket to a gala, I get admittance to a gala. I'm paying for, a magazine subscription for part of this, fundraiser. I get a magazine back, but you get a donation. Transformational fundraising ideally is reframing the idea of fundraising that it shouldn't be pay to play, that it shouldn't be this transactional relationship, between two bodies where I'm only going to give if I'm going to get. So transformational should be seen as I'm giving for the sake of giving for something that I believe in, and not to just receive a good in response for my giving. I hope that is helpful.
And I know you just gave an example of one type of fundraiser, but do you have any other types of fundraiser that you would describe as transformational?
Absolutely. What we really aim to do is, at the end of the day, of course, we are still aiming to make money, and we still host fundraisers rooted in money, but we try to do it in a way where you can participate and not have to spend money. So, for instance, this could be a dance-a-thon where students are asking for donations from and families and from people in the community to be dancing. We'll have a DJ come to a school and they'll dance for however long they can dance. And every kid still gets to dance outside of if they're raising money or not. They don't have to raise the money to attend the dance. And or drop my kid off at this movie, it would look like suggested donation $5 for the movie. It just said my internet was unstable. Can you see me?
We see you now. You checked
Okay.
out for a little while, but you're back.
Okay. A drop-off movie night with a suggested donation, but everyone can attend. That is another example. We also do sales. We would do like a plant sale in the spring and a pumpkin sale in the fall. And you can still, it's not a barrier to entry. You can still come to the event and participate, but you might not take home a pumpkin or a plant, but you're still there and can enjoy, set out cider or donuts. Those are just a couple examples. Apologies for my internet. I think my kids are on their iPads. I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's great. Now I just want to check in with the interpreters to see if they have anybody on their lines who want to ask questions.
I think they're all set, and are also able to ask questions in their own language.
Right, that's true. Right, that's true.
There was one last question that was asking if, thanks, Fran, asking if, do you have any suggestions on how to effectively work with the school to have a successful fundraiser? Ways to get teachers and parents who might not regularly attend meetings involved. I'll also encourage, if there are folks in the chat that have successful stories, to respond in the chat, because a lot of the success stories that we hear are from holding these communal spaces and being able to connect PTAs that might be often siloed to each other to share their success stories. But the panel, do you have any suggestions?
I'll just say very quickly, providing food, providing childcare, providing translators, and really considering the timing of the events in terms of making sure it is in the evening, like now, for example, and maybe even the format in terms of having an in-person or maybe a virtual option for participation. Yeah.
Anyone else want to add anything?
I like what Dr. Murray just mentioned, that we also have had moments of wondering how we can bring more staff members in our school to collaborate with us for these fundraisers. And we have really found that a lot of these things are happening outside of working hours, and the teachers, it's a big ask. They've already been working, all day and doing so much labor for our children that we have found when we go to them and ask for their ideas and bring them to the planning table, not reactively inviting them to these things, but bringing them to the table to brainstorm them, we get a better response in that way. So I think building the partnership over time and bringing them to the discussion is key.
That's a great point.
One thing I'll just add too, I've been talking about this a lot in conversations with PTA parents, is just how difficult it is when you're replicating so many of the same fundraisers across schools. It's so hard because everybody's struggling to get participation. There's just a few parents at each school that are working really hard to plan everything, who also don't have a ton of bandwidth, and just how much lighter the lift is when you're trying to plan something a little bit more collaborative, maybe with another PTA, maybe with another group of PTAs, but how kind of the spirit of collaboration can really lighten the load on everybody and can just make this process more efficient, right? Like I like saying this, but the equitable option can also be the more efficient option as well, right? Like, everybody benefits when we're more collaborative rather than in our own silos trying to plan and do everything on our own.
All right. If there aren't any other questions, Naya, all right. So you have all of our contact information in front of you, and there's some contact information for some pro bono assistance. PTAs often ask us how they can become 501c3s, and if you do want to become a 501c3, A660 mandates that you get your own legal advice. And so this is some pro bono legal advice, New York Lawyers for Public Interest, and their contact information is there. And then I wanted to also give you a resource. This is just sort of a calendar of a suggested calendar, PTA year at a glance. These are some of the responsibilities that you can expect when you are a PTA exec board member, and you can use the QR code on the screen to go directly to the link on our website where that lives. And then just please subscribe. This QR code will take you to where you can subscribe to our mailing list, so you can get all the our latest newsletters and find out when our next webinar is. We hope to do a spring in-person get-together. We have a space now that has a roof terrace, and we're hoping we can get a good group of people together where we can talk PTA. I'm also thinking to do some office hours. So if you sign up for our newsletter, you'll get all the information about that. We're also going to make sure that we send you all the video of this webinar afterwards. And thank you so much. Good night. Thank you so much to Dr. Brittany Murray and Dr. Claire Mackevicius. I know I said it wrong. I've said it wrong the entire time. I apologize. Dr. Claire, can you say your last name correctly for me?
Mackevicius, but
Mackevicius, Dr. Mackevicius, and Dr. Courtney Burke. And thank you to our interpretation team for providing their interpretation services. And thank you to my director, Naya Berg. Good night, everybody.